If someone had told me that a taxi driver would save my 40-year marriage, I would have laughed. But on the hottest morning of that summer, my husband and I climbed into the back seat of a yellow taxi, convinced we were on our way to end our life together. We weren't arguing, we weren't crying. That was the frightening part. After 40 years of marriage, we had simply run out of words. My name is Margaret. I'm 62 years old. For most of my life, I believed love wasn't measured by grand romantic gestures. It was measured by quiet mornings, shared grocery lists, burnt toast, forgotten anniversaries that ended in laughter, and someone remembering exactly how you liked your coffee without ever asking. That had been us for decades, until it wasn't. People always imagine marriages fall apart because of affairs or lies. Ours didn't. It disappeared the way a shoreline disappears during the tide, so slowly that neither of us noticed until there was almost nothing left. It had started years earlier, after retirement. The children moved away, the house became quieter, our conversations became shorter. Instead of asking, "How was your day?" we started saying, "Did you pay the electric bill?" Instead of sitting on the porch together, we watched television in separate rooms. There wasn't one terrible fight. There were thousands of tiny silences. Each one built another brick in a wall neither of us realized we were building. One evening, about 6 months before everything changed, Richard looked at me across the dinner table. He quietly said, "Do you ever feel like we're just roommates now?" I remember pretending not to hear him, not because I didn't know how to answer. The truth hurt too much. After that, we stopped pretending. We stopped planning vacations, stopped celebrating anniversaries, stopped making promises. We simply existed beside one another, like two polite strangers sharing the same address. Then, 3 weeks before the taxi ride, Richard placed an envelope on the kitchen counter. He didn't even look at me. "I've spoken to a lawyer." I stared at the envelope for what felt like hours. Divorce papers. 40 years, reduced to a stack of neatly printed pages. Oddly enough, I wasn't angry. I was exhausted. Maybe that's worse. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Neither of us tried to cancel it. Neither of us tried to save what was left. When Tuesday finally arrived, the weather forecast promised the hottest day of the year. It felt strangely appropriate. Even the air seemed too tired to move. Richard carried one small folder. I carried my handbag. That was all. 40 years together, and everything we needed to end it fit into our hands. Neither of us wanted to drive, so I called a taxi. A few minutes later, an older silver sedan pulled into our driveway. The driver looked to be in his early 70s, neatly dressed, gray hair, kind eyes. He stepped out, opened the rear door for us, and smiled. "Good morning." Richard nodded politely. I forced a smile. Neither of us mentioned where we were going. I simply gave him the courthouse address. He glanced at us in the rearview mirror for just a second, then nodded. "Of course." The car pulled away from the curb. Neither Richard nor I knew that before this ride was over, one wrong turn would change everything. The taxi had barely been on the road for 10 minutes when traffic came to a complete stop. Cars stretched as far as I could see. Construction crews had closed the main avenue leading downtown. The driver sighed softly and glanced at his navigation. "Looks like they're repairing the bridge," he said. "We'll have to take a different route." Richard didn't even look up from the window. "Fine." The driver nodded and slowly turned onto a narrow side street lined with old maple trees. At first, I paid no attention. I was too busy staring at my hands. 40 years ago, those same hands had trembled while putting on a wedding ring. Today, they rested quietly in my lap, almost empty, almost strangers. The taxi rolled through another intersection, then another. Suddenly, I looked outside and froze. "Richard?" He didn't answer. "Richard?" This time he followed my gaze. Across the street stood a tiny brick bakery. It hadn't changed. The faded blue awning was still there. The old wooden sign still leaned slightly to one side. Even the flower boxes beneath the windows looked familiar. Richard smiled without meaning to. I haven't seen that place in years. Neither had I. The driver noticed us looking. "Do you know it?" I laughed quietly. "Know it? That's where he proposed." The driver raised his eyebrows in surprise. Richard chuckled for the first time that morning. "Not exactly." He looked at me. "I planned to propose in the park." I couldn't help smiling. "But you were too nervous." He nodded. "So instead, I asked you while we were waiting for cinnamon rolls." The memory filled the car. For a moment, we weren't an old couple driving to a courthouse. We were 22 again, broke, hopeful, certain that love alone would somehow be enough. The taxi continued. No one spoke. Not because the silence was uncomfortable anymore, but because every street seemed to carry another memory. We passed the tiny grocery store where we'd bought our very first dinner after moving into our apartment. Canned soup, bread, and one slice of chocolate cake because we couldn't afford two. Richard laughed softly. "You insisted on splitting it perfectly in half. Because you always stole the bigger piece. I still think you cheated." I looked at him. After 40 years? I'm still not over it. The driver smiled, but wisely stayed quiet. A few minutes later, we crossed a small bridge. Below it flowed the same narrow river where we'd spent countless Sunday afternoons feeding ducks after church. "Remember when our oldest son fell into the water?" Richard asked. I laughed so hard that tears filled my eyes. "You jumped in after him before realizing the water barely reached your knees." He thought I was a superhero for weeks. "You let him believe it." "Of course I did." The laughter faded, not into sadness, into something warmer, something we'd forgotten existed between us. Outside, the city continued rushing through another ordinary Tuesday. Inside the taxi, time had slowed. The driver finally broke the silence. "You two have been married a long time?" Richard answered quietly, 40 years. The driver gave a slow whistle. "That's longer than I've been driving this cab." Neither of us explained where we were going. Neither of us had to. He glanced once into the rearview mirror, not at our faces, at the way we had unconsciously moved closer together during the ride. Then he returned his eyes to the road. "Funny thing about wrong turns," he said, almost to himself. "Sometimes they take people exactly where they forgot they needed to be." Neither Richard nor I answered, but for the first time in months, I found myself wondering something I hadn't dared ask before. Were we really driving toward the end, or were we simply taking the long way back to each other? By the time we reached downtown, the traffic had started moving again. The courthouse was only 15 minutes away. For the first time since leaving home, I wished the ride would last longer. Neither Richard nor I mentioned it, but I had a feeling he was thinking the same thing. The taxi turned onto another quiet street. On the corner stood an old movie theater. Its bright red marquee looked newer than I remembered, but everything else was exactly the same. Richard smiled. Our first date. I laughed. No, our second. He frowned. Second? The first date was terrible. He looked genuinely offended. Terrible? You talked about baseball for 2 straight hours. The driver laughed out loud. Richard pointed at me. You never told me that. Because I liked you anyway. Then why did you agree to a second date? I looked out the window before answering. Because when you walked me to my front door, you stood there for 5 whole minutes trying to find the courage to kiss me. He laughed quietly. I remember that. I know you do. I thought you were waiting. I was. The taxi filled with soft laughter, not loud, not forced, the kind of laughter 2 people only share after decades together. Then, just as quickly, the laughter disappeared. Richard stared through the windshield. When did we stop laughing? The question landed heavily inside the car. No one answered immediately. Finally, I whispered, I don't know. And that was the truth. Neither of us could remember the exact day. There hadn't been one. Life had simply become louder than our marriage. Jobs, children, bills, parents getting older, doctor appointments, mortgage payments, broken appliances, school concerts, college tuition, grandchildren. Somewhere between surviving life, we forgot to live it together. Richard spoke so quietly I almost missed it. I thought you stopped needing me. I turned toward him. What? He kept looking forward. After the kids grew up, you seemed happy on your own. I stared at him in disbelief. Richard, I thought you stopped needing me. Now he looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in months. Why would you think that? I smiled sadly. Because you stopped talking. He nodded slowly. I didn't stop talking because I didn't love you. He swallowed hard. I stopped talking because every conversation felt like I was bothering you. I felt something inside me break. 40 years. 40 years. And we had both spent the last several believing the exact same lie. Not that we had fallen out of love, that the other person already had. The driver remained silent. His eyes stayed on the road. But I noticed the small smile that appeared for just a moment. He had heard enough. Richard rubbed his forehead. Do you remember the night we painted the living room? I laughed through my tears. Everything turned blue. Even the dog. Especially the dog. We both laughed again. Then he became serious. Back then, he looked at his hands. We had almost nothing. I nodded. But somehow, I felt richer than I do now. I reached across the seat without thinking. My hand rested gently on top of his. He looked surprised, not because I touched him, because I hadn't in a very long time. Neither of us pulled away. Outside, the courthouse was now only a few blocks ahead. I could already see the top of the building in the distance. For the first time that morning, instead of wondering how quickly this would all be over, I found myself wondering whether we had made the biggest mistake of our lives before we had even walked through those doors. The taxi slowed to a stop in front of the courthouse. No one moved. For a few seconds, the only sound inside the car was the ticking of the turn signal. The driver turned slightly. "We're here." Neither Richard nor I answered immediately. Finally, Richard reached for his wallet. He paid the fare. The driver handed him the receipt. "Take your time," he said, with a gentle smile. It seemed like an ordinary sentence. At least, that's what I thought. We stepped out into the blazing summer heat. The courthouse towered above us, cold, gray, unwelcoming. People walked in and out carrying folders, briefcases, and expressions that all looked strangely alike. Some looked angry, some relieved, some completely numb. Richard adjusted the folder beneath his arm. "Ready?" he asked. It sounded less like a question and more like something he felt he was supposed to say. I nodded. Ready. But neither of us sounded convinced. We climbed the wide stone staircase. Every step felt heavier than the last. 40 years, 40 birthdays, 40 Christmas mornings, thousands of ordinary Tuesdays, all leading to this one. We reached the entrance. Richard stretched out his hand toward the large metal door. Then he stopped, completely. His fingers rested on the handle, but he couldn't pull it open. I looked at him. His eyes weren't on the courthouse. They were fixed on his own hand. And then I noticed it. Without even realizing it, his thumb was slowly turning his wedding ring, back and forth, back and forth, exactly the way he had done on our wedding day. I hadn't seen that nervous habit in years. The memory hit me so suddenly it almost stole my breath. I smiled through tears. "Richard." He looked at me. "You're doing it again." He frowned. "Doing what?" I gently pointed at his hand. He looked down. Only then did he realize he was turning the ring. He stopped immediately, then gave the smallest, saddest smile. I didn't even notice. Neither did I, until that moment. I took one slow step closer. "Are you scared?" He didn't answer. People brushed past us on both sides. The courthouse doors opened, then closed again. Life continued around us, but for us, time had stopped. Finally, Richard whispered, "No." A long silence followed. Then he looked directly into my eyes. "I'm afraid of losing 40 years because of one difficult year." I felt tears roll down my cheeks before I even realized I was crying. For months, I had prepared myself for anger, for blame, for bitterness. I wasn't prepared for honesty. I shook my head. "Richard," my voice broke, "I don't want to become your memory." His eyes filled with tears too. "And I don't want you to become my biggest regret." Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then, almost at the same time, we both laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because after months of silence, we had finally said the one thing that actually mattered. I reached for his hand, slowly, carefully, as though I were afraid he might pull away. He didn't. Instead, his fingers wrapped around mine exactly as they had 40 years earlier. Warm, familiar, safe. I smiled. Let's go home. He looked at the courthouse one last time, then back at me. Without hesitation, he nodded. Let's go home. Together, hand in hand, we turned around and walked back down the courthouse steps. Halfway down, I looked toward the curb. The taxi was still there. The driver was sitting quietly behind the wheel. His phone rested in his hands as he scrolled through the morning news. When he noticed us walking back together, he smiled. He locked his phone, placed it on the dashboard, and without saying a word, reached over and unlocked the rear doors. Richard couldn't help smiling. You waited for us? The driver leaned back comfortably. 40 years together? He shrugged gently. I had a feeling you'd need a ride home, not a ride to the courthouse. Richard looked at me. I looked at him. For the first time in what felt like forever, we both laughed. The kind of laugh that only comes after surviving something you almost didn't. Then we climbed back into the taxi, this time not as two people driving toward the end of a marriage, but as a husband and wife finally finding their way back. No one spoke for the first few minutes after we got back into the taxi. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. Richard reached for my hand. This time, neither of us hesitated. The driver glanced at us in the rearview mirror. A quiet smile crossed his face before he focused back on the road. The courthouse slowly disappeared behind us. I watched it through the rear window until I couldn't see it anymore. Only then did I let out a long breath. It felt as if I'd been holding it for months, maybe years. After a while, Richard spoke. I'm sorry. I turned toward him. For what? He looked out the window. For believing silence was easier than honesty. I squeezed his hand. Then we're both guilty. He looked surprised. I should have told you I was lonely. I smiled sadly. Instead, I kept pretending I was fine. He nodded. So did I. The driver finally spoke. His voice was calm. Can I tell you something? Richard and I looked up. Of course. He kept both hands on the steering wheel. I've been driving this taxi for 28 years. He smiled. You meet all kinds of people. Young couples in love, parents bringing babies home from the hospital, families going to funerals, people celebrating promotions, people who have just lost everything. He paused. And sometimes I drive couples to the courthouse. Neither of us interrupted. Most of them spend the whole ride blaming each other. They argue. They shout. Sometimes they won't even sit next to each other. He smiled gently. You two were different. Richard frowned. Different how? You never insulted each other. You never called each other names. You didn't sound angry. He looked at us through the mirror. You sounded heartbroken. No one said a word. Because he was right. We hadn't stopped loving each other. We had simply stopped telling each other. After another minute, the driver chuckled. You know what I noticed? Richard smiled. What? When I picked you up, there was almost a foot of space between you. He glanced in the mirror again. Now I don't think I could fit a newspaper between you. Richard laughed. Probably not. I rested my head lightly against his shoulder, something I hadn't done in years. It felt familiar, like coming home after a very long trip. When we pulled into our driveway, neither of us moved immediately. The house looked exactly the same. The white porch, the blue shutters, the roses I'd planted 20 years earlier. Nothing had changed, except us. Richard paid the fare once again. Before getting out, he leaned toward the driver. "I don't know your name." The driver smiled. "Samuel." Richard extended his hand. "Thank you, Samuel." Samuel shook it firmly. Then he looked at both of us. "Don't thank me," he smiled warmly. "I only took the wrong road." He paused. "The two of you chose the right one." Neither Richard nor I knew what to say, so we simply smiled. As the taxi slowly drove away, Richard slipped his hand into mine. He looked at our front door. "Would you like to go inside?" I looked at the house that had witnessed 40 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, forgiveness, and ordinary days that once felt too ordinary to appreciate. I smiled. "Only if we start over." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Then let's knock." I laughed. "Richard." "We've lived here for 38 years, he grinned. "I know. But today," he reached for my hand, "I'd like to be invited in again." And for the first time in a very long time, our house didn't feel like the place where our marriage had almost ended. It felt like the place where it had begun all over again. People often ask me what saved our marriage. They expect a complicated answer, counseling, a miracle, a dramatic confession. They're always surprised when I smile and say, "A wrong turn." Of course, that isn't the whole story. A wrong turn didn't save us. It simply gave us enough time to remember who we had been before life convinced us we were strangers. The real work began after we walked back through our front door. The next morning, Richard made coffee, not because it was his turn, because he wanted to. He placed my favorite blue mug in front of me, the same mug he'd bought me for my 50th birthday. "Good morning," he said. Those two words shouldn't have mattered, but somehow they did. For months we had lived in the same house without truly greeting each other. Now every morning started with those same two words, "Good morning." A week later, we canceled the divorce. 2 weeks later, we started taking evening walks. At first, we barely made it around the block, not because we were tired, because we had forgotten how to talk. It was awkward. Sometimes we'd walk for 10 minutes without saying anything. Then one of us would point at someone's flowers or laugh at a squirrel chasing another squirrel. Little by little, the conversations came back. Not all at once, just enough to remind us they had never really disappeared. Richard even found the old photo albums hidden in the attic. Every Sunday afternoon, we'd open another box. We laughed at our terrible hairstyles, our tiny first apartment, the camping trip where the tent collapsed in the middle of the night, the Christmas when our youngest son covered the dog in glitter. Some memories made us laugh until our stomachs hurt. Others made us cry. But every single one reminded us of something important. We had built a beautiful life. It deserved more than being thrown away because we'd forgotten how to protect it. 3 months after the courthouse, I surprised Richard with 2 tickets. "What's this?" he asked. "A movie." He looked confused. "On a Tuesday?" I smiled. "It's our second first date." He laughed exactly the way he had inside the taxi. When we arrived at the theater, it was the same old cinema we'd passed that morning, the one where we'd remembered our awkward second date. This time, when the movie ended, he didn't wait 5 minutes to kiss me. He held my face in both hands, just like he had 40 years earlier, only this time he wasn't nervous. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the day we almost divorced, we decided not to stay home. Instead, we called a taxi. When it arrived, I looked through the window and immediately smiled. Richard laughed. "It can't be." It was Samuel. He recognized us before we even opened the door. "Well," he said with a grin, "this is a much nicer destination, I hope." Richard smiled. "Much nicer." Samuel looked at us for a moment, then nodded. I knew it. Halfway through the ride, Richard leaned forward. "Samuel, I've always wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." "That day, did you really get lost?" Samuel smiled to himself. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said quietly, "The bridge really was closed." Richard and I looked at each other. Samuel continued, "But there were 2 detours. One was faster. The other," he smiled, "passed through your old neighborhood." I stared at him. "You chose that road?" He nodded. "When you gave me the courthouse address, neither of you looked angry. You looked like 2 people carrying 40 years on your shoulders." He glanced at us in the mirror. "I thought maybe, before ending a lifetime together, you deserved to drive past the place where it all began." None of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. When we reached our destination, Richard paid the fare. Before getting out, he asked, "Samuel, why did you wait outside the courthouse?" Samuel smiled the same gentle smile I'd never forgotten. "Because after driving people for almost 30 years, you learn the difference between couples who have stopped loving each other." He paused, then looked directly at us, "and couples who have simply forgotten how to say it." Richard reached for my hand. I squeezed his fingers. This time, he wasn't turning his wedding ring. He was simply holding my hand. 41 years after saying "I do," I finally understood something. Love doesn't usually disappear in one terrible moment. It fades in thousands of tiny silences. And sometimes it returns because of one unexpected conversation, one brave apology, and one taxi driver who chose the wrong road, the road that led us home.